Welcome back, everyone, to the Birds of a Feather Talk Together podcast. We've got a really exciting episode this week as we talk about the birds of paradise. Shannon and John are both experts on the birds of paradise and teach us a lot of fun things about them, from their mating rituals to all their exotic coloring and what makes them so unique. It's really fun to discuss. So thanks for joining us. We invite you to sit back, relax, grab your binoculars, and let's take a look at the birds of paradise. So this is episode number 2, and we were going to talk about the birds of paradise a little bit. So I know that there's a lot of different species of birds of paradise. Do we want to talk about a particular one to start with? Maybe one of the specimen that you have at the Field Museum?
And actually, there aren't that many birds of paradise species.
Okay.
Like, depending on whose taxonomy, 43 to 45. But they get outsized excitement because of what they look like and how they dance and how they behave and stuff like that. So one of the things that always is interesting to other people is if you look at the tree of life for birds, birds of paradise are in the part of the tree of life that have crows. So our crows, which are, no offense, kind of dull in pattern and color. It's not always true, but compared to birds of paradise. So our crows are cool. They have the density of neurons that higher primates have. So if someone calls you a bird brain, it's actually a compliment. But they certainly don't look or have the charisma in that sense of birds of paradise. I mean, it's hard to imagine birds like that even exist because I don't think humans have the imagination that evolution provided to make all of the kinds of birds of paradise there are, all the elaborated feathers, all the incredible displays, all the interesting innovations associated with how those feathers move, the nerves and muscles that are at the bases of these feathers to let them, manipulate them in their displays. Birds of paradise are exciting.
When we show people birds of paradise in the collection, which, as you know, it happens to be right next to the Gee Whiz drawer, is where the birds of paradise are. One of the things that that I think people are always amazed by is the fact that this is all about sexual selection, and the males have all these incredible adornments and things, and the females are cryptically colored and basically designed to be as unobtrusive as they can because they literally are the sex that makes things happen. I mean, they're the ones that are going to take care of the nestlings and incubate the eggs.
Yeah, the males leave. They dance, have sex, and leave. They don't help at they don't build nests. They don't help at the nests.
They don't do anything but dance.
But it's the females that are choosing. So we focus, and this is true kind of across birds and through history of ornithology, that we focus on males because it's usually males that we think of as brightly colored, males that are singing, males that are displaying. But really, a lot of groups, it's the changes in female plumages. There are a lot more of those than there even are of males, because if all the males might be brightly colored, but there's something to learn if the females are changing through evolutionary time, being brightly colored or not. But it's the females that are doing the choosing. So the males have to impress a female, and they go to elaborate lengths. And when females prefer males that have a novelty, you get novelties, a lot of them, and they go to extremes, like a peacock's tail, for example. That tail certainly is not going to help a peacock run away from a predator, but it is super duper attractive for females to look like that. And so the ornamentation on birds of paradise is really unlike any other group of birds, I think. There are a lot of bird groups that have dancing and really interesting displays, but the birds of paradise.
And this is a situation where technology has kind of revolutionized our appreciation of this too, because a lot of these most birds of paradise are on New Guinea. There are a few species that get off the island, but they live in very dense forests. It's dangerous forest. It's not an easy place to go work in. And there was a group from a combination of folks from National Geographic Society and Cornell that spent 7 or 8 years of field time getting to the most remote sites in New Guinea and getting high quality video of these dancing displays. And so I think that's been something that has just been marvelous to me, because it was just, again, unimaginable to have that kind of video of what these things were doing.
But the really fun thing for me, the novel thing of what they did, is that they photographed and filmed the birds from the bird's eye view. So not from like me standing on the ground with my binoculars looking up at a bird of paradise, where it might look cool, but when they went up and saw it from the female's vantage point, the birds look completely different, and so do their dances. So there are parts of their feathers, patterns that you don't see from the ground. And so if you want to know why females are choosing or what they're choosing, you got to go up in the tree sometimes, or you have to look down from on top, because a female might be on top looking down on the bird. So if you're underneath looking up, you're not seeing what the female bird who's doing the choosing is seeing. And so the innovation of both taking that technology into pretty hard to get places, but to also think about being a bird and not a human, which is kind of what you have to do to really provide data that helps you understand for real what these birds are doing. So that was pretty revolutionary, and it really changed how I look at the birds of paradise that I always show people when we're in the museum. My favorite specimen is a blue bird of paradise, by far. I didn't know that right away, but as soon as I started giving tours, I picked that bird up first every time. Even though there are lots of other cool birds, they just like all fade away to the blue bird of paradise, which has these. Every time I look at that, I think of all the functions of feathers. That's why I love that bird so much. Is we think of feathers evolving for heat conservation. You think of them for flight. But there's no reason they have to look like that, right? The wings can function as a airfoil to give you lift and help you fly without being bright blue. And, you know, things can keep you warm without looking like velvet or lace or all the other patterns that come out when you start looking at those. And so the idea that females can choose, and there's enough underlying variation, genetic variation, to let all those things play out over, you know, millions, tens of millions of years of evolutionary time, is really cool. And it always strikes me that there's got to be something different about birds of paradise and how they make feathers that is unique to that group, that has enabled them to explore a lot more of plumage space than other birds do. So, you know, there's such an experiment, and anybody should go look at videos online of birds of paradise.
I remember like when Planet Earth, the David Attenborough show, came out, like the birds of paradise, I wasn't familiar with them until seeing that, and it just blew my mind. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so incredible. So are you, with your specimen, are you like able to display them the way that they would look when they're mating? Is that something like what?
Or doing the dance?
If you go into public exhibit areas, a lot of times they will try to pose them as they might in life.
And actually our bluebird of paradise that's in the main exhibit area is actually hanging upside down, which is how these birds display.
Wow.
And it's the feathers on the tail spread out and make this spectacular pattern that you wouldn't see if the bird was sitting upright.
Wow.
So I mean, we definitely try to do that. That's one of the things that museums think about a lot.
But unfortunately, the Field Museum is one of the only places where you can take a trip through the Tree of Life for birds in a public exhibit space, because that was considered like a cabinet of curiosities, and a lot of museums don't devote space to that anymore, and so they've taken them all back behind the scenes and put them back in the collections. But it was really important for Field Museum to keep that. We teach using it, so we bring students in there using the collections in the public exhibit areas, and you really can get a flavor of the diversity of birds in a way that it would be hard to do upstairs, because we have so many. I don't know how many steps you'd get, but it would be more than 10,000 steps in a day to kind of traverse the Tree of Life in our actual collections. But to see them like that is, I think, a real treat. And we updated the exhibit, 10 years ago now, to have modern taxonomy in it, because now that we're doing a lot of work on the tree of life for birds, there's all kinds of things we didn't know that we do know now. So there's a whole bunch of birds of paradise that for centuries have been with birds of paradise. And when people started using DNA-based characteristics to look at the tree, well, some of them don't. They're not birds of paradise, even though they have bird of paradise in their name. They're not. So, and some things that never were near them before, when you actually make a tree, a high-quality tree with high-quality data, well, then these ones are more closely related than the ones we used to think. And that happens throughout birds, that with rigorous analysis and a combination of both molecular and morphological data, we've completely changed what we think about the bird tree of life.
Okay.
So,
wow. Yeah, and then of the specimen that you have, then, so did any of them come from Wallace? So, we've been reading The Feather Thief, and we're just kind of learning about Wallace and all his contributions. I think if we're talking about birds of paradise, need to at least mention him and his collection.
Well, that's an interesting thing. So one of the specimens that I like showing people that we have is of a greater bird of paradise, which is this fairly widespread species, and it gets to the Aru Islands. And if you look at the tag on this specimen, it dates to the Rothschild collection, which is a collection that was made by a baron in England who got specimens from around the world. And somebody has written on this tag, "Old specimen collected by Wallace, Aru Islands."
Oh, wow.
And so, in theory, that could be a Wallace specimen. But I always like to point out that the data on tags tells you a lot about the history of those birds. And clearly, somebody thought that bird was collected by Wallace, but it wasn't Wallace himself who left a tag on that bird that clearly indicated that he collected it.
Yeah.
And if you look in the literature, you can find that in about 1853 or so, when Wallace was working in the Malay Archipelago, he was in the Aru Islands, and he actually wrote a paper on the display of greater birds of paradise. So it's conceivable that it could be a specimen that was collected by Wallace, but I always like to point out that it was received on exchange from the American Museum of Natural History, in one of the things Shannon was talking about in an earlier episode with respect to trading specimens. And I think the willingness of AM&H to trade that specimen was predicated on the fact that they really didn't know that that was a Wallace specimen, or they probably wouldn't have done it. And yet, I think it's a good chance it is. Yeah. Now, that particular bird, though, is a really great story because its scientific name is Paradisea apoda. And apoda means without feet. And I always like to point out that this is another aspect of early specimens. Well, that bird was described to science by Carolus Linnaeus, who was this Swedish researcher in the 1600s who came up with the binomial system of nomenclature. And he was getting life, so birds and everything else from all over the world. And whoever sent him a greater bird of paradise prepared the specimen with no legs. And he described it to science as never landing. And it is, we like to point out in the collection, if you look at this bird of paradise, this greater bird of paradise that we have that says collected by Wallace, you can very clearly see it's got perching bird feet, just like all other perching birds. And it took about 30 to 40 years for the scientific community to realize that Linnaeus had a specimen that didn't have complete morphology with it.
Yeah, there are all kinds of quirky stories.
Oh, yeah.
Nested within all of these birds. But yeah, so when I look at that bird of paradise, that blue bird of paradise, the reason I pull it out is because it's blue, first off, and I am fascinated by how colors get made. So there's actually no blue in that bird. Blue is a structural color, so it's the way the keratin and air are inside of either the barb or the barbules of a feather, because either one of them can be filled with different things and make different colors, and that's what, and it scatters blue light back to your eyes the same way when it rains you don't get blue dye on you. It's not exactly the same, but
yeah.
it's
Right.
kind of similar
Yeah.
to that. And so it's the structure of the feather that makes blue light come back to your eyes. There's almost no blues in nature.
Wow.
Blues are almost always structural colors. Some plants have blues, but it's really not common. Butterfly wings, again, that's a structural property. Reds, yellows, browns, and blacks, those are pigment-based colors. And so if you wanted to ruin a bird of paradise, you would just smash its feathers, because if you smash its feathers, they're not going to be any blue anymore. They'll turn brownish, grayish kinds of colors, which I didn't even think about doing that, but someone who works with us did that in front of me one day. She took a bird feather and smashed it, and I'm like, holy cow.
Wow.
It went gray.
Wow.
But yeah, and so there's all these, and then there's all these fantastic colors in birds of paradise. Super black, which is a new, like, super duper black color that's been described recently.
It's like the absence of any color, right? It's like so black that it's like
densest of dense
Okay.
blacks. And so when you look at birds and you think about how they might have made all of those colors, and you think of the colors getting potentially selected on too, but how do you go from something that might have brown or pigments in its black pigments in its wings? How do you get a blue? How do you get blue from that? What happened to make that? And so that's every time I look at that bird, I think about kind of how that might have happened, and I think of it hanging upside down. And when you look at it close up, another reason why I like dead birds, if you look at it close up, you can see just the fantastic detail that are in the feathers. When it hangs upside down, it has this breastplate thing that it splays out. And when you look at it, even though it's all folded up and they're all laying down like little soldiers, you can see very clearly how demarcated that is, and just how precise the feathers are arranged, and that they they evolved that way and they are developed that way. It's really kind of fantastic. I mean, what makes a cell produce these weird feathers that come out of the area around your ear? Yeah. And why there? Because weird ear feathers is kind of common in birds of paradise. So why do they do that? Yeah.
And how many of these? I mean, are a lot of these colors only on display during like mating rituals, or I mean? A lot of when I saw like the kind of the displays and everything, it was like you couldn't really see a whole lot, and then it's like all of a sudden they would open everything up.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's certainly, I mean, when you're that bright, you're opening up yourself to predation, and certainly with ornamentation, that's absolutely the case. And so there are ways in which they can probably disguise some of those colors at least part of the time until they're ready to display. And I was thinking about this when we were talking about this earlier, is one of the things is how important birds are for human culture, because over time the tribes in New Guinea have witnessed some of these things, and you can absolutely imagine how that's gotten incorporated into various aspects of their thinking and customs and things over time, and you see that around the world.
John, can you give an example of that?
I think a lot of if you ever get a chance to see the display of a satyr tragopan, which is a pheasant from China, the males hide behind these rocks, and then they come up with this. They have a blue face and these bright orange bodies with these spots, and they'll ruffle their wings, and they'll just and I'm absolutely sure that has been picked up by people over time and incorporated into Chinese dance and things. Or
even into clothing. That's what I see when I watch Birds of Paradise, when I watch the videos. Of course, I've never seen a live bird of paradise, maybe in a zoo, but is the way the Birds of Paradise can finely undulate their feathers and with control, with all these muscles and nerves that are at the base, and they can finally move them as part of their dance.
Oh, wow.
There's no doubt people are inspired by that, and women's clothing is comes directly from what people experience with respect to nature. There's no question you see that. I mean, we used to hunt a lot of birds in North America to almost extinction for women's fashion in the early 1900s, right? So,
and greater birds of paradise and other birds of paradise were sought after for the same millinery trade. Yeah.
Yeah, and for the indigenous peoples in the areas, birds in particular form a lot of the special things that they, or even the average things that they make. So there's tapestries that are full of birds in varying ways, including skeletons sometimes, and all these feathers in these cloaks. South America's full of parrots, macaws and things like that, all these fancy feathers and things that are used in human rituals.
And are there protections on a lot of these birds then? I mean, are there some of these countries, don't have governments like ours? I mean, are they making efforts there to make sure that they aren't hunted for feathers in certain areas? Is that kind of a common thing, or are some of these at risk now?
Yes, and at the same time, I mean, a cogent argument can be made for the fact that Native peoples have been doing this for a long time and can do it in a sustainable way. And so So I think there's a lot of variation across the world with respect to what's going on in those kinds of situations.
Okay.
In New Guinea, I would describe as having one of the largest remaining indigenous populations where there isn't a lot of connection, with the outside world in a lot of areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting.
But certainly in North America, there have been laws that are put in place. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act, for example, that prevents people from sacrificing migrating birds to protect them because they were being hunted to extinction. And that is something that governs what we do. You need permits to collect birds. You have to have a justification to sacrifice birds. And that, I think, is important and necessary. But that doesn't mean you don't still have to do it. We have to document biodiversity. The only evidence of past life on Earth is in collections. And you can see by the amazingness of passenger pigeons, Carolina parakeets, that ivory-billed woodpeckers, that the only way we learn about them now is through museums. And so I feel like we have a sacred obligation to preserve the things that have been collected historically and to provide immortality to birds that die anywhere near a museum so they can go and become part of the collections. And then scientists will tell their stories into the future too. As technology changes, the things we learn from specimens is constantly changing.
Oh, yeah.
So, and people put the specimens in the 1800s or even the early 1900s in our collections. They didn't know what the inheritance molecule was. They didn't know what DNA was. They certainly didn't know we were going to snip off a piece of a toe pad of a 100-year-old bird and sequence its entire genome, right? So that wasn't even conceived. And so, birds are visible in ultraviolet light. So there are parts of their eyes, they see in ultraviolet. We can't see what they see. So we're kind of poor lookers of birds from that perspective.
Interesting.
But spectrophotometry rose up and got more available and affordable. And so then, people started going through the collections. Do these birds reflect in ultraviolet light? And they do. Across the whole tree of life, there are birds that do that. And we can't see that, but now we know that it happens. And you need specimens to be able to answer these things. It's changing technology. The specimens are always there. Our ability to look at them is completely different through time. Now we can use fancy microscopes to look inside of a feather and see what it is. Now we can use CAT scans to look inside of birds. John's leading a really big project, the bird part of this really big project, CAT scanning birds from collections all over the U.S. at least, and that enables us to peek inside. It's why I can study bird brains. It lets you peek inside without destroying the specimen, which is really
Wow.
important. So I don't know what the next revolution will be. I just know that people will use our specimens to tell more stories about them.
Of the birds of paradise specimens that you have at the Field Museum, how many of them are extinct?
And none.
None.
Oh, they're
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, we don't know. I wouldn't say that because I don't know how many people have looked, and we can't say for sure that there are no birds of paradise that are extinct. I mean, we can say that we don't have any ones that are extinct, although it could be that we have populations that have gone extinct. I don't know about that, but
Well, that is an interesting thing about birds of paradise. There was a project done looking at the population variation within species, and there's an awful lot of population variation across the various species that this is one of the things that we always find interesting with respect to how we do stuff, which is that how different is different enough to recognize something as a different species is a whole nother aspect of this. And birds of paradise they live in a landscape where they're isolated in different mountain valleys across the country, and some of those have evolved slightly different shades of color in various parts of the plumage, and they may have other traits that are different, and people just haven't had a chance to look at them.
And I have a question. I am really interested in the planet Earth part with the birds of paradise, and we were wondering. I think they showed like several males, kind of. Is that correct?
Yeah, competing at the same time.
At the same time. Is that for real? Or was that editing?
no, things like that happen. They make leks, which means that there can be many males displaying for a female. Okay. Not all species do this, but yeah. So then again, the female's choosing, right? Mm-hmm. So you can dance your whole life and never have sex, because you're not high enough in the status rankings. So there are the New World equivalent of these are called mannequins, and they have fancy feathers too, and they make fancy noises like perfect harmonics that come from vibrating the wing, for example. So it's not just vocalizations that coming from the vocal box of birds. Their feathers can make very odd noises, harmonics, snaps. And mannequins are full of that, but they have all these fancy dances. Again, where there's multiple males often.
But they're in these cases the males are working together. To attract females.
Yes.
Even though only one of the males, which they call the alpha male, will actually gain a copulation mate with the female. Yeah. And the hypothesis is that the other males are helping that male and gaining the potential to take over the territory at some point, and also probably learning, how to dance. And so
a wingman.
I was going to say, is that where wingman comes from?
Yeah, it could be. I don't think birds of paradise actually have any examples like that
of multiple males.
Yeah, like helping each other out in the same way that.
No, I think multiple males might display in the same area, but not in a cooperative. Fashion.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions that can be that DNA has helped us answer too. And you might think that the only reason you would help is that you're related to the alpha male.
Okay.
Right? Because then you can put more of your genes through your relatives into the next generation. But that's not the case. So with DNA, we can tell that these birds are not fathers and sons and things like that. So we know that now for these birds.
Yeah.
But you never know. I mean, maybe they can sneak in some fun along the side.
Yeah.
But you could, these are fairly long-lived songbirds, but you could spend as a male bird your entire life in a subsidiary role, waiting for the alpha male to die or for you to outcompete them.
It's like Scar and Lion King.
Is what makes them alpha that they're the most beautiful, or?
Well, that's again, it's the female's perception.
Okay.
And so that's still a challenge out there with respect to trying to figure that stuff out. What is it that the female sees? because the evidence suggests in a lot of these situations that whatever one male is doing is more attractive to most females than what the other males are doing. And so again, and yet at the same time, I think in these situations, the other males are also cognizant of what's going on too. And so they're learning, and that may help drive the kind of crazy evolution of all these dancing patterns that you actually see.
Wow. Yeah, mannequins have this thing called a popcorn dance, where there's a whole bunch of males and they circle around a perch and jumping up and down like popcorn and jumping over each other, sometimes 5 to 7 males, depending on the species. You should look at that too.
Oh, wow. Okay.
There's really fantastic videos of those too, and they have really interesting feathers. As well. So there's lots of things that are like that. And the interesting thing about color is whether it's an honest signal of things. So there's been a fair bit of research done looking within, say, males within a species, and there can be differences in how red something is or how yellow something is. And the question is, if females prefer things that are redder, well, you can study that. But then what are they signaling with that red? So there are a lot of hypotheses about you're signaling your quality as a male, that you reject parasites better, that you have a better immune system, for example, that you have better food sources because the yellows and reds are carotenoids. They come from the diet. They might get modified in the bird before they're deposited, but they come from the diet. So are you signaling your superiority as a mate by being brighter, by having a slightly better dance than someone? So, but then there was a really interesting book by a guy named Rick Prum, he's a professor at Yale University, and he wrote a book called The Evolution of Beauty, where he argues, and very interestingly, if not a bit controversial for some, that it could just be beauty itself.
Oh, interesting.
They're not signaling anything by being slightly brighter red or anything like that. It's just that maybe females just like pretty things.
They're just superficial.
and that's enough to drive things like birds of paradise. It might just be because they like pretty things. And if you have enough genetic variation to make pretty things are going to evolve over very fast evolutionary time frames too. That's the thing about sexual selection, is that it can make novelties, and novelties go very quickly throughout a population because there's such an advantage to possessing that novel characteristic.
There's a family in the same part of the evolutionary tree as birds of paradise called the bowerbirds, and they're famous because the males actually build structures that they use to attract females. And at the same time, some of the species will bring in bits of color, and it's very consistent bits of color that they'll just find pieces of plastic and things like that in areas that they often live near urban areas these days. And so they'll decorate their bower with purple things. And so, that suggests that at least in that case, maybe it is just like baubles that'll actually get people to come.
Humans are changing
female to come
the
in.
Cultural aspects of bowerbirds because they are leaving their garbage all over the place, and that garbage is colors that nature doesn't have. There's no blue, so most of the time, unless you're getting some berries or something, you're not decorating your bower with blue. So they create this house and then they decorate it as kind of like an homage for the female. But now they're changing color preferences.
Oh, wow.
The birds are, based on the fact that there's a lot more blue things in their environment, bottle caps, the twisty things that you pull off of a plastic bottle. And they're using things like that because if you prefer novelties, if everything else in your environment is yellowish or shades of whatever, you can build the best structure with all of these beautiful sticks. I mean, they're incredibly elaborate, but if I'm the first male bird to bring back a blue bottle cap, everybody's going to come and look at my bower.
Yeah.
And then the other males are like, well, I better find some blue too, because it's not working for me anymore.
Yeah.
And so it changes the culture of the birds.
Wow.
So is a bower, is it a nest? Like, is it where the female would?
No.
It's a male built structure, and it's
for
literally
display.
just for display. And they're very interesting because they're different in different species.
Wow.
And so it's basically taking the bird of paradise example and going in a completely different direction.
Sure.
It's going structural.
Wow.
It's like cribs.
Yeah. Bachelor pad.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
you should definitely take a look at videos.
Yeah.
So are
and
those in
pictures
Chicago?
No.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're Australia and New Guinea, both. And there's a setup bower. I'm trying to remember the species. I should be able to remember in the bird hall. In one of the displays, which is really neat.
Okay.
That's awesome.
Great. Well, I think we're getting close on time, so maybe we can do mailbag questions and then wrap it up.
Sure.
This is from Pam in Steamboat Springs. She said, I really enjoyed listening to episode 1. Looking forward to more. Our town has a lot of pride in our sandhill cranes, which migrate through every year. Will you all do an episode on sandhill cranes?
Oh, we should definitely do that because it's a spectacular story.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this is a bird whose populations have come back dramatically from the 1800s, and so it's a neat story, and obviously cranes have all kinds of really cool aspects.
We lived in Colorado, and so we would see them migrate through there.
Yeah.
And then I grew up in the western suburbs of Chicago, and I feel like we didn't see them out there. And now that we live closer to the lake, we see them migrate through. But it was crazy, like growing up, being not that far away from where we are now and never seeing them.
Their populations have expanded dramatically since you were, I'm not saying you're old because I'm really old, but you're not. And their populations have increased pretty dramatically over our lifetimes.
Wow. I didn't even realize
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have to make sure to cover that on our Sandhill Crane episode, so that's really exciting to hear. And I think that wraps it up for our mailbag questions for this episode. So thanks, everyone, for listening and for writing in. Please send us more mailbag questions at podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you. You've been listening to Birds of a Feather Talk Together podcast, a podcast all about birds. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We really appreciate it. Once again, we're an independently run podcast, and we're looking to get some exposure, so please help spread the word. If you love birds, if you found our topics interesting, please share this with someone. Please write into our mailbag as well, podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. If you have any recommendations, any questions, we're always looking to interact. So thanks, everyone, for tuning in. We appreciate it. We've got some exciting things coming up. We'll have a full mailbag episode coming up soon, and we'll also focus on sandhill cranes coming up soon. So thanks, everyone, for listening, and have a good one. Thank you also to Earhole Studios in Chicago for letting us record. As I mentioned before, we're an independent podcast and just getting up and running, and Earhole has been so generous as to allow us to record there. So we really appreciate Earhole Studios. Thank you.